Welcome to this presentation introducing author Ralph Ellison and his novel Invisible Man. Ralph Ellison was born on March the 1st, 1913, and he died April 16th, 1994, at the age of 81 due to pancreatic cancer. Ellison will go down in history for the 20th century as one of the probably one of the most talented writers of the 20th century, and certainly one of the more notable African-American writers as well. His quality of work has never been in doubt. His quantity of work is limited compared to other writers of the 20th century, Hemingway, Faulkner, and people of those merit. And so when it comes to being ranked among top writers, his name probably slips down the list a little bit due to the lack of quantity of work that he has completed. His most famous piece by all means would be Invisible Man, lengthy novel which we're going to be looking at in this unit. Very rich in content, very rich in literary elements, motifs, and it's an excellent piece of literature that we're going to be investigating. Ellison, as mentioned, is born in 1913. He's born in Oklahoma City. His full name is Ralph Waldo Ellison, and he is named after Ralph Waldo Emerson, transcendentalist poet from New England in the 19th century, who his father was a great admirer of. His father, however, dies when Ellison is very young, at only 3 years old, on a construction site. And so Ellison grows up primarily without his father. His mother is a domestic servant, essentially a housemaid, growing up, and she does become involved with some, becomes termed as radical political movements for several years. What this would really lend itself to is more of some socialist and communist groups, which during this point in the early to mid 20th century is really looking at African Americans as a group of people that would greatly strengthen its numbers of communism and socialism within the United States. Of course, with socialism, communism, you're spreading the idea of all people are equal, all people will be equally compensated, regardless of what their trade is, regardless of the socioeconomical status that they already have. And so this becomes a very appealing form of government and economics to African Americans. Ellison certainly uses this concept of socialism and communism within his novel in the latter half with the Brotherhood, an organization. Roz, the exhorter, would be a person who speaks down against this within the novel, and so this element is something that Ellison really tries to integrate into his novel as well. Ellison ends up being accepted and entering the esteemed Tuskegee Institute in 1933. This, of course, is the institute which is founded by Booker T. Washington. Ellison does not go there to study literature. He actually is enrolled into to study music. He is unable to graduate, not because of academic difficulties, but because for financial reasons he's unable to continue after 3 years. So at this point he ends up moving to New York City, specifically Harlem within New York City. And Harlem in the 1930s is right in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance, which is, creative explosion of African American literature, music, culture into the United States of America. So this is a big, powerful, and important time for someone like Ellison to be in New York City. He very quickly becomes acquainted with two well-known writers, Richard Wright and Langston Hughes. Richard Wright, author, Hughes, an esteemed poet of the era and even today, with both of their literatures. And the two of them really encourage Ellison to pursue a career in writing, which is something that he takes note of and does pursue, in addition to careers that he likes to have with music, specifically jazz music, photography, sculpture. So Ellison is a very well-rounded, educated, artistic man, but certainly his claim to fame in his life does end up being his literary career, which is promoted by both Wright and Hughes within the Harlem Renaissance. In 1937, Ellison publishes his first short story, Jaime's Bull. A major concern of Ellison is the social equality and justice, and so this comes through in a lot of his writing. And much like his mother, he does have a brief stint with the Communist Party in the 1930s. This is, however, a very brief stint, and he really disassociates himself from it rather quickly. Um, During the 1950s, when he is a rather major writer and literary figure within the United States, he does get mentioned with Senator McCarthy's Red Scare, the blacklist that he is doing of writers such as Arthur Miller, um, within the United States at the time. Ellison is fortunately absent from the United States during a lot of the 50s as he's traveling abroad, so this really does not impact him all that much. But his brief stint with the Communist Party does kind of come back a little bit in the 1950s when McCarthy is in the midst of his Red Scare that he is sending throughout the United States. From 1937 to 1944, Ellison has over 20 articles and reviews and short stories printed in various publications. Also, he is enlisted in the military at this point, and is in Europe for some time, so he is unable to really have a steady literary career at this point. However, upon his return to the United States is when he really is able to focus on his writing. In 1946, Ellison gets married, and at this point he is working on his composition Invisible Man, which becomes published in 1952. Essentially, the text is exploring man's place and identity within society. There's a lot of historical biography and allegorical elements to this. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, all of these figures throughout black culture and history in the early 20th century are referenced throughout the work. There's also a lot of literary references such as Dante's Inferno, speeches, and other works which we'll get into as we proceed throughout this unit and this work. But it's important to note that the text explores man's place and identity within society. Certainly part of this is the African American man's place and identity within society, but it can also be argued that Ellison is looking at man in general, not simply just someone of one specific race. However, some racial tensions and abuses do really become highlighted throughout the work, and so that is something that he is looking at as well. There's a stark contrast that he's looking at between northern and southern racism and alienation during the 1940s. Most people will probably look at the southern area of the U.S. having more of the racism and alienation, but he does bring to focus how this happens in the north as well. And that really becomes how the book is split up, where the first portion of the book takes place within the south, and then the narrator, who remains nameless throughout the whole entire book, and he'll be referred to as Invisible Man or the narrator, ends up moving north and still has to deal with some of the racism and alienation that he was having in the South. Takes place for him in New York City in the North as well. Invisible Man wins the National Book Award in 1953, and Ellison also wins the Nobel Prize for Literature due to this work as well. In 1965, the following decade, it's selected as the most important book since World War II by some prominent literary experts within the United States. And so certainly the acclaim of the book, the content of the book is recognized as being very important, as well as an enjoyable book to read for many years after its publication in 1952. Following the publication of his novel, Ellison becomes essentially an international literary icon. He does much traveling throughout the United States and the Europe continent in the 1950s, giving speaking tours, and really is absent from the U.S. for much of the 1950s, which in hindsight is probably a good thing for him with the Red Scare and whatnot, as we mentioned, that McCarthy is involved in. He ends up coming back and accepts some teaching positions beginning at Bard College, and then in 1964 begins teaching literature at Yale, and then also later on at Rutgers University. In 1967, Ellison has a little bit of some personal disaster takes place. He has a major house fire which destroys hundreds of pages of various manuscripts that he's working on. The major one is that his second novel is Juneteenth, and over 300 pages of his manuscript is lost, and this novel was not published during his lifetime. Ellison dies in 1994, and I believe it is in 1999 when the novel is finally published after his death. And it's a completed text, but it is put together by his literary executor as to what Ellison probably would have wanted. So we never really do get this second book of Ellison the way that he actually wants it. So while Ellison does have essays and short stories that are released and published during his lifetime, Invisible Man does remain as his only novel that is ever published during his life. As mentioned, Ellison dies of pancreatic cancer in 1994. He dies as an accomplished educator, writer, sculptor, photographer, and musician, and so very much a man of the arts. And as mentioned, in 1999, Juneteenth is published under Ellison's chief literary executor. Over 2,000 pages of various manuscripts existed at the point, and as mentioned, it's condensed down to 368 pages. This novel that Ellison has been working on for 40 years was pieced together by his estate as best they could. So again, it doesn't get Ellison's final stamp of approval as this is what he wants his second novel to be, but it's the best guess as to what Ellison would have liked his readers to have enjoyed. Invisible Man is a very complex text that we're going to be analyzing. It's developed from an initial short story centered around the Battle Royal, which takes place in Chapter 1. The opening of the book is the prologue, and this is something that does need to be read as well as the epilogue at the end of the book. They're essentially the first and last chapters of the book. But Chapter 1 is very closely centered around the short story that Ellison writes earlier in the 1940s Battle Royale, and only has to change a little bit of it to fit to the context of his novel, Invisible Man. He is addressing several social and intellectual issues that are facing African Americans during the post-Civil War era. Really, this 100-year period from the end of the Civil War till the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So there's this 100-year period where essentially black culture, African Americans, aren't treated with equality at all, and really have a tough time finding their own place and identity within the United States of America. And so with Invisible Man, it's looking for the search of place and identity within any type of culture. A lot of things that we'll want to pay attention to is his rich use of rhetorical strategies, techniques, a lot of imagery, allusions, metaphors. You really want to identify motifs rather quickly. Because he really likes to build off these concepts, especially a running motif. Dream sequences are things that begin early on, and these are important ideas for you to kind of keep track of. He strategically uses words white and black throughout. White, black, light, darkness, blindness. These are all terms that are repeatedly used throughout the whole entire text, and they're strategically used for imagery purposes with his metaphors, and really does a great job of creating some vividness and descriptive detail for the reader. The idea of invisibility, is this something that should be a curse, a blessing, is it both? This is an idea that becomes developed throughout the whole entire work. And when we get to the character of Reinhardt in Chapter 23, I think the reader will begin to get a better understanding of the narrator's viewpoints of invisibility. And as mentioned, the literary references throughout the text are something that readers want to pay attention to. And we'll call attention to some of those things throughout lessons within this unit. I hope you enjoy Invisible Man. It is a complex book, but it's a very rewarding book. And it's a very good book when it comes to the AP Literature and Composition exam that you're going to be taking in May, because this is the book that comes up most frequently on the open-ended response question. So if you're able to have a good understanding, working knowledge of Invisible Man going into that test, chances are for that final essay question, which we'll talk about more as this course proceeds, you'll probably be in really good shape to answer that question. So pay close attention. It's a deep book, but it's one that will serve you well as you continue on through this course and in college as well. Good luck.